Yeah, let me introduce you here real quick. Let me get us started. It's right on time. We're exactly on time. All right, so we've got 3 papers. This is the religion session of this undergraduate research program. We have 3 presenters. I'm going to start first with Alynda. Alynda, what's the last name? Worrell. I should have known that. Alynda Worrell on perfectionism and spiritual religious struggle. Each one of these we're presenting on Zoom as well, and so we're going to be recording this as well for anybody afterwards. I'll just kind of keep track of time and see if we go. So, Alynda.
Okay.
I'm going to start share screen. So. Hang on, I'm just trying to. There we go. Should go now. All right.
Okay. Hi, I'm Alynda. This is my 499 psych research that I did with Dr. Mills as my mentor. So last semester, as I was beginning to think about my topic for my 499, I just had a series of really interesting conversations with a number of my close friends that just kept turning to topics of grace and perfectionism and how they saw that interacting with their walk with God. So I was just observing them, and I kept noticing that although they were seeking God more authentically than almost anyone I knew, these struggles just kept coming up over and over and over for them as they would describe their faith to me. Oh, I think I went the wrong way. Amazing. Okay. So this sort of led to the broader question that I settled on for my research, which is, what is the relationship between perfectionism and spirituality? And specifically, in what ways do perfectionism and spiritual struggle interact with one another? So some of the key findings that I found as I was doing my lit review that sort of led to me forming my own hypothesis was first that a positive correlation has been identified between perfectionistic discrepancy and legalism, with a negative correlation for experiences of grace. So perfectionistic discrepancy has been defined in this context as describing sort of the dissonance that people feel between how perfect they think they should be and how perfect they actually see themselves. Secondly, I found another really fascinating study that used research using EEG monitoring that has suggested that highly fundamentalist individuals are hyper aware of their own mistakes. So participants were monitored while they were performing a task that was designed so they would fail periodically at it, which just sounds kind of mean, but most people have heightened performance monitoring after they make a mistake, but those who also scored high in religious fundamentalism have also displayed hyper performance monitoring when they were doing well at the task. Similar findings have been found in clinically diagnosed OCD patients. And these participants were constantly suspicious about how they had performed, even when they were doing the task correctly. But they didn't actually do any better on the task than other participants in spite of this heightened awareness. Oh, I clearly don't know when to change my slides, but that sums up everything I just said. And then also, maladaptive perfectionists tend to have higher levels of scrupulosity than both adaptive and non-adaptive perfectionists. Maladaptive perfectionists in this sense have high discrepancy and high standards. And again, discrepancy is this belief that you'll never live up to your own standards of perfection. High standards simply mean that you want to do well and expect a lot from yourself. Adaptive perfectionists have low discrepancy but high standards. And non-perfectionists have low discrepancy and low standards. Scrupulosity is a persistent concern over sin and a compulsive need to engage in religious activity. And finally, yet another study showed a positive correlation between dysfunctional religious perfectionism and family rigidity and family enmeshment. Participants high in dysfunctional religious perfectionism tended to describe their families as extremely structured with an emphasis on roles and rules. It's hard to say. So my hypothesis is that students with high measures of perfectionism will also have high levels of spiritual struggle. The scale I chose to use to measure perfectionism is the Frost Multidimensional Perfectionism Scale. I chose this because it measured both healthy and unhealthy dimensions of perfectionism, and more importantly, for my purposes, internal and external dimensions. So this especially included the subscale of parental criticism as something that I felt would be relevant in my research. It was also developed with college students in mind. So you can see some of the subscales. We have concern over mistakes, and I have an example up here. The fewer mistakes I make, the more people will like me. Parental criticism, I never felt like I could meet my parents' expectations. And then the other subscales were personal standards. Other people seem to expect lower standards for themselves than I do. Parental expectations, only outstanding performance is good enough in my family. Doubt over actions, even when I do something very carefully, I often feel that it is not quite right. And organization, I try to be an organized person. People were asked to rate on a 5-point Likert type scale how much they agreed with each statement as it applied to themselves. And then this is the scale I use to measure religious and spiritual struggle. I chose this scale also because it measured several different dimensions that I thought were very interesting, including both internal and social dimensions. The subscales were our divine struggle. And these were asked in the form of how many times in the past month have you felt? And then they were again supposed to answer on a 5-point Likert type scale. So divine struggle would include items like how often have you felt angry at God in the past 5 months? Demonic struggle would be how often have you worried that the problems you were facing were the work of the devil or evil spirits? Ultimate meaning struggle is questioned whether your life will really make any difference in the world. Doubt-related struggle, you felt troubled by doubts or questions about religion and spirituality. And I was especially interested in moral struggle and interpersonal struggle. Examples of these would be how often they have worried that their actions were morally or spiritually wrong, and how often they felt hurt, mistreated, or offended by religious or spiritual people. So my more specific hypothesis would be that there would be a positive correlation between the Frost Multidimensional Perfectionism Scale and the subscales concern over mistakes and parental criticism, with the religious and spiritual struggle scales, specifically with moral struggle and interpersonal struggle. So I formed a survey through Qualtrics comprised of these 2 scales, as well as some demographic questions. And this was distributed through email to all Milligan students, both undergrad and graduate. There were 92 respondents with a female majority. Especially note the age range and the mean. It was much wider than the range was much wider than I was expecting, as well as the mean being higher than I was anticipating. I think I might. Okay, there we go. We're good. I also asked a question related to religion. Obviously, I had more options to answer for this, but these were the only ones that got any responses, as well as I had a text box for if they felt the best option was not listed. This is something I think I would do differently if I redid the survey, because at this point I've done 2 different surveys on like religiosity, and this question just always confuses people for some reason. So like I had lots of people type into the text box that they were Baptist, and I would like have to go in and change it to Protestant. So as far as unspecified Christians go, I don't really know what that means at this point. That could just be a bunch of Methodists and Baptists, and I don't know, who just didn't see that on the screen. But as you can see, Protestant is still the majority of my participants. So here are my results, which is just lots of fun because, as you can see, all my correlations are negative. So they all went in the opposite direction of my hypothesis. So it was really exciting because they're all also statistically significant, I will point out. So that was a fun moment as all these little asterisks were popping up on my screen, and then I started looking closer at them, and I was like, oh, this is very strange. So the correlations ranged from moderate to very slight, but they were also statistically significant, mostly at the 0.001 level. So let's look into that just a little bit. So one thing that I think I would also do differently is neither of the scales that I used utilized reverse scoring. So usually scales include at least a few questions that have to be answered in reverse to still get a higher score. So if you answer highly agree on a question, that would be scored at 5 points on a normally scored question. But on a reverse scored item, highly agree would be worth 1 point. So an example would be, in normal scoring, I feel rejected or misunderstood by religious people. And then on a reverse scored question, it would be, I felt loved and accepted by religious people. And it just kind of makes sure participants are on their toes and actually reading the questions. But neither of the scales I use actually use these, which was an interesting choice. And I don't know that it would make a big difference, but it's not something I really thought of until we were analyzing my data. I also didn't include any measure of religiosity, which I also regret, just because I'll kind of unpack maybe some different interpretations, but I think that would have been a useful thing to measure in hindsight. And then finally, the Frost multidimensional perfectionism scale, as I mentioned, was developed with students in mind. And as you saw, my age range was very broad, and my mean age was actually outside of maybe what most of us would consider traditional student age. So that's also worth noting. I especially could imagine that being important for parental criticism subscale. I don't know, maybe it doesn't hurt as much when you get older, who knows? And it's possible that my hypothesized effects would only be visible in highly religious populations. So a lot of the studies I looked at were of teenagers in the Latter-day Saints church, which is just an incredibly specific demographic. But they saw all of these effects that I was talking about. But without my measure of religiosity or fundamentalism or anything like that, there's really no way for me to find that out now. And then something else that we discussed is just that individuals high in perfectionism may also be high in foreclosure or maybe low in questioning. So they just might not reach a point where they're engaging in serious spiritual struggle. It's been found that behavior-focused religiosity is also negatively correlated with flexibility and positively correlated with a high need for closure and cognitive rigidity. So, like I said, they just might not reach that place. So some possible directions that I thought about the past few days are just, again, examining the relationship between perfectionism and fundamentalism, I think would be a really good start. And then a clearer link just might be evident there. And then again, I just think that idea of cognitive rigidity would be, again, something really interesting to look into as it related to religiosity and spiritual experience. So, my references. Does anyone have any questions?
I'm interested in, first of all, where you found the scales that you used, the tools you used, and did you see anything? Would you maybe pick a different one? Or I know you talked about the negative and positive, but were there other options that maybe you want to revisit?
Yeah.
You've done this?
Yeah, definitely. So I just found them as I was doing my lit review. The same ones just kept coming up over and over again. And yeah, like I said, this one was, the perfectionism one was really directed at students. So I think like if I had known that I was going to get a broader range, I might have gone with, there was another one that also came up about an equal amount, but it didn't really measure as much like family influences. So I chose this one. I might reconsider that.
Yeah.
And then as far as the religiosity one, there were lots of different options. I didn't decide on that one until like towards the very end of my lit review, because there were so many that I also thought were interesting. Like I considered doing like a scale on shame, or again, scrupulosity, like we talked about earlier, I think also would have been really interesting to look at.
Yeah, I think we often think of perfectionism as a bad thing, maybe it's negative, but it, as you were explaining it, I thought, you know, it would be interesting to look specifically at those adaptive perfectionism scales and see if the correlation is even stronger, or you know, if it's in a different direction.
Yeah, I actually, like, when I get a chance, well, I still have access to the computer lab, I want to go back and like look at the sort of the two subscales that make up adaptive perfectionism on the one I used. I just like, I didn't want to do that as a shot in the dark and then find something like that didn't go with my hypothesis. It wasn't relevant. That felt like cheating. Yes, exactly. They felt like cheating. But I do want to go back and look at the data I have and see if maybe there is a difference between the adaptive and maladaptive ones.
I'm interested in the issue of this religious intentionality, you know, and it makes me wonder how religiously committed many of our students are, whether our sample here is itself more. I mean, I guess I would have assumed we're more like the Latter-day Saints in some ways, say an average population, but it makes me wonder about the actual sample and what it says about the sample. So, you know, to expand that to include the religious intensity would have been really an interesting multiple correlate.
Because you're still only getting a section of, and obviously you've got some grad students and maybe a lot of grad students. It's hard to tell, but with the age skewing, it seems like you've got that. And so, would they be more or less? I mean, it's very interesting, the religiosity, but like who are we really? And maybe next time only do undergrads or
Yeah, well, a big part of this idea, like when I was talking about my friends I talked to, most of them are in seminary, and I'm like, these are the most uptight people I've ever met in my life. I just want to know what's going on.
Sometimes say, last step before you walk away.
All right. Well, we are approaching 10 till, so we're about the end of it. If there's a final question, comment at all, please feel free. All right. Thank you. Let's give a hand. Good presentation. Thank you very much. Our next presentation is from Matthew Haagen, entitled "The Big Idea: How VeggieTales Used Bible Stories to Tell Kids About God." I am going to, first of all, kind of minimize this and get his PowerPoint up. So if I can figure out how to do that. All right.
The Zoom is muted for the people on Zoom. We can't hear the presentation.
This is great. The Zoom is muted. So he's talking. The first presentation came through great. And this now it's just muted. So we can't hear any of it.
Is anyone saying anything like this?
Yep. Elizabeth posted a chat and then someone unmuted and just said, hey, we're muted. Actually, I think Mary's there. I'm going to see if I can message her. She's messaged us.
You're right, it is.
All right. So, hi everyone. I'll catch you up. My name is Matthew Haagen. I am talking about VeggieTales and how they used, which is a Christian animated cartoon, and how they used Bible stories and what methods they used to turn Bible stories into animated films.
Yeah, I texted
I
Mary
think
and
that
told him and
catches us up.
starting
So
over.
the Jonah movie very well took the story of Jonah and relayed it into their
Well, I guess he's not starting
film
over.
very
He's just picking
accurately.
up.
So I wanted to look at, does that happen with more than just the Jonah movie? Did more VeggieTales do that? So we're going to talk about, if we can get this working again. There we go.
Are you interested
We're
in
talking
hearing
about the
this or no?
basics of biblical interpretation, particularly exegesis. Exegesis is the primary method which Bible scholars use to determine the original meanings of Scripture. So to properly exegete a passage, a student or minister or whoever will, exegesis is literally bringing interpretation out of the text. Instead of taking interpretation and putting it into the text, you take it out of what the text originally meant. So you consult the time period, the historical and cultural background, contemporary literary genres, speculate if you can't actually identify the author identity. Take a look at, try to find out who the original audience was and the original message. After you've done all of this, you can hopefully look at what you might think is the correct interpretation. So, does VeggieTales use exegesis? That was my question. So I watched a couple of VeggieTales cartoons it was arduous labor to determine for the research. It was very painful, and compared them with scholarly resources on these books to see how well they matched up. So I looked at two examples: Jonah, a VeggieTales movie, which was the first big thing they did. It was the first theatrical release. It was a much longer than the others, put in a lot more work. And the very first one, made in the almost a little bit better than Garage, Where is God When I'm So Scared, made in 1993. So we'll start with Jonah, a VeggieTales movie. For those of you who have not seen it, I will kind of go over what happens there. So in the beginning of Jonah, a VeggieTales movie, a group of vegetables are off to see a concert by a musical artist named Twippo. Don't know who that's supposed to be. And there, a couple of the different vegetables, two specific pairs, get into arguments, whether someone's teasing the other or they're just annoying each other. And it all leads to them having an accident involving a porcupine, and they have to stop at a seafood restaurant where they meet the pirates who don't do anything. They are a group of pirates who, instead of lying, cheating, and stealing, don't do anything. They eat Cheetos. So the pirates notice that some weird dynamics are going on, and they decide they want to help. So they start telling, first of all, Junior the asparagus, and then the rest of the vegetables, story about Jonah the prophet. Jonah is a prophet in Israel, and they describe him as kind of a mailman, a messenger from the Lord to the people. And he'll go to different towns, and in a Broadway level musical number, I'm a music major, I love the musical stuff, describes in the Old Testament laws and general guidelines of being a good person. Do not lie, do not cheat, wash your hands before you eat. If you do all this, you will all live happy lives. And Jonah that night, after preaching to this town, he often is sent to Israelite cities to do this. He hears a message from God that he's supposed to visit another town, but this time it's Nineveh. The Ninevites are bullies. They lie, they cheat, and worst of all, they slap people with fishes. And Jonah wishes that God would incinerate the Ninevites, not forgive them. So Jonah decides to run away to Tarshish, sailing with the same pirates from the seafood restaurant, and he meets Khalil, a half caterpillar, half worm rug merchant who decides to be his traveling buddy. As anyone familiar with the story of Jonah might expect, a storm comes, and in an unfortunate game of Go Fish, Jonah is found to be guilty of sinning against God. And he's thrown into the sea and swallowed by a whale, where he and Khalil, who has gone with them, meet angels who sing to Jonah about how God is a God of mercy and love. And he gives everybody a second chance. The narrator tells us that Jonah prays, promising to go to Nineveh if he is released, and the whale releases him and Khalil onto dry ground. They travel to Nineveh and get captured because of a theft. And Jonah tells them, I've been in this great whale, and they want to listen now. And he speaks his message to stop lying, stop stealing, and stop people with fishes, or they will be destroyed. And unfortunately for him, the Ninevites are greatly moved by his speech, and because they did not know what they were doing was wrong. That was completely normal for them. So the king orders the city repent and pray to God to forgiveness. Jonah goes up to a hill because he still wants the Ninevites to be destroyed. So he sits under a plant. He's waiting for this to happen. The plant dies, and Jonah is upset that God will not destroy the Ninevites. And that's where we get this scene from the film. It is going to play. There we go.
It's gonna go.
I think.
Yeah, it's gone. I think so. Get it to start. I'm not sure.
Okay, a link. So we need to reshare the screen.
Grammarly helps make your
Okay,
writing
I'll,
clear and
hang on,
concise.
I'll expand it
No
here
matter
if
where
I
you are.
can.
With Grammarly
Can't
under
see.
clear info,
You have to switch
always
the
have
screen
it at
share
your
to
writing
the web browser.
Land the job
Do it
with
if you
cover
can. I
letter
don't know how
that
to do it.
stands out. Thanks to flawless writing and compelling word choice.
This is
Inspire
weird.
your
Let
team
me
with
first,
perfect presentation
um,
by catching and correcting errors in
embedded.
spelling, punctuation, and grammar.
interesting.
Okay, I'd minimize this.
Impress your boss
I'll
with
try
a
to expand
well-written
this.
Because
proposal.
those
Straight to the
videos
point.
are playing at the same
And
time.
make sure your writing comes across the way you intend.
How are we going?
All right. That's not right. It's not supposed to still play. Where's the audio coming from? It's paused. I think it's coming from this.
I don't know where it's coming from. I can't tell you. Oh, it's coming from here.
It's paused though.
Want me to stop it?
I don't. Oh, it's right there. That tab. Okay. So we can stop. Yeah. All right. I think we got it figured out. Let's go back to Zoom. And here we go. Right, that's correct. So Jonah, the Jonah movie very well follows the theme of mercy and compassion. If we look at the differences a little bit, Jonah, it also leaves it an inconclusive ending, which is original to the story, and asks the question of the viewer, who gets mercy and compassion? So if we look at some of the differences between Jonah VeggieTales movie and the original, there are some slight differences. In the VeggieTales adaptation, Jonah prays to God for forgiveness in the belly of the whale. In the original, he does not ever repent. This is an interesting one. In the VeggieTales version, Halil corrects Jonah at the end, whereas in the original, God corrects Jonah in a dialogue at the end of the book. This is probably because Phil Vischer and the rest of the VeggieTales had a big aversion to representing God and Jesus in their cartoons. They were very careful about that, so this is probably an effort to get away from that. The central theme of Jonah, a VeggieTales movie, God is merciful and compassionate towards us, so we should be merciful and compassionate towards others. The original is a little bit different. God is merciful and compassionate towards Israel, so why shouldn't God be compassionate towards others? But on the whole, very similar meaning, very well adapted, exegetical. In a discussion I had with Dr. Jackson, one of our Bible instructors here, he said, while there are some minor inaccuracies, many of these are committed by Study Bible Introductions across publishers currently. So very well done. So does this continue? And in the very first one, did they do this? And for other VeggieTales, is this the same process? So we're not there yet. Hopefully that does not start. So their very first one was based on, they had the story of Daniel in it. And the whole show is trying to teach kids that they do not need to be afraid because God is watching over them. They can trust God and not be afraid. So there's a little bit of a Calvin and Hobbes-ish, Bob and Larry pop out in Junior's bedroom and teach him that he doesn't have to be afraid of the boogeyman. Then we have a silly song, and then we get to Daniel in the lion's den. King Darius has had a dream, and Daniel was able to interpret it, and Darius is going to make him second in command. But the other officials of the kingdom do not like that because they want to be second in command. So after a song that contains a funky beat and 3-part counterpoint, I'm a music major, they finish up, they tell King Darius, we want to put out this rule that whoever is praying has to pray to you and not anybody else. Daniel, of course, breaks this rule, and he is thrown into the lion's den. So you have this scene in the lion's den. Daniel's thrown in, and he is afraid of all the lions who are out to eat him, much as I would be myself. So I will. There it is. That's still the PowerPoint.
Daniel also knew God's law.
Here we go.
They're gonna eat him. They're gonna lie on it. Well, maybe they're gonna lie on it, then eat it. Or one will lie on it while another one maybe eats him. Or maybe one will sit. Like lions are gonna cooperate, like one's gonna lie on him and say, hey, you eat him, I'll lie on him. Come on. We're the ones that are.
I originally cut all this out, but it's entertaining.
What's that so scary down here? Little musty, not so scary. Oh no, what am I gonna do? It looks like I'm gonna end up as lion stew. Don't cry, Dad. Daniel, don't you know you're not alone? There is one who is watching you. He listens when you pray. And though it seems this time you won't get me, God has made a way.
So does Daniel in the lion's den from Where's God When I'm So Scared match up with the actual story of Daniel? The VeggieTales version, King Darius has had a dream. In the original, there is no dream. He's just such a good advisor that he is going to be placed over the kingdom. In the VeggieTales, this is understandable. The advisors escape. In the original, they do not escape. They are thrown into the lion's den. We can understand why VeggieTales is not going to do such a thing. The central theme of Daniel Lion's Den and the entire Where's God When I'm So Scared cartoon is we do not need to be afraid because God is with us. Whereas the central theme of Daniel in the Lion's Den and the whole book of Daniel is the importance of being faithful to God when under foreign rule, the importance of religious fidelity. In the words of the Anchor Bible Dictionary's entry on the book of Daniel, a lifestyle, a model lifestyle for the diaspora, that we can still be faithful in the kingdoms that we are placed in, even whenever we are told not to. Could be written during the time of the Hellenization of Israel and an encouragement to the Jews there as well. So it's not exegetical. They had this message of do not be afraid and took the story of Daniel Lion's Den, which makes sense that someone would be afraid in such a situation, and use that as their message. So what have we learned today? I was kind of at first a little bothered that VeggieTales wasn't completely exegetical, but I think it seems like Phil Vischer is kind of doing what Walt Disney did with fairy tales. I got to talk to Phil Vischer a little bit over LinkedIn, and how they typically would go about interpreting a Bible story is they take a study Bible, look at the plot points, and use that for their stories. For Jonah, they spent more time researching in general, both historical designs and architecture, and also looked in some commentaries. So they end up coming up with the correct interpretation. But most of the time, they just kind of took the plot points for their message to kids. And I thought about it, and Walt Disney never looked at the historical context of Cinderella and what it meant in its original time to its original audience and the socio-political background. He just took this story of Cinderella, slapped on, if you believe with all your heart, your dreams will come true. And in a way, VeggieTales is doing the same thing, but with a more positive message. And this has affected like church life and kids my age for a long time. When my mom was about my age, she was at church and she was teaching the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This was the mid-90s. And this child corrects her and says, no, it's Rack, Shack, and Benny. And my mom, not knowing anything about VeggieTales, says, no, it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. No, it's Rack, Shack, and Benny. Kid is very insistent, knows the story. This is the name of the people. So my mom talks to their parents afterwards and finds out about this VeggieTales cartoon, which she and my dad start watching, and they passed on to me, which influenced my lifelong obsession with silly songs. But this kid in church knew the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in a way that they wouldn't have known if not for Rack, Shack, and Benny and the many other VeggieTales cartoons, even if they're not completely developed exegetically. And I hope that in the future we will have more quality media like this that teaches kids about God in such a quality fashion. Thank you.
Time for one question. We're running a little late because of that.
I will say, I would like a Bible curriculum for Bible study classes, for students, for kids. And I think they often do this stuff with Daniel. I don't think that this is moving that far away from what our Bible, like you look at Sunday school curriculum, they often do this type of stories.
Yeah, and that's what's so crazy about the Jonah movie. A lot of people and kids' curriculums will focus on Jonah's running away from God when that's a very minor point in the book. So not they were very close. I thought it was really cool.
I can remember watching the Jonah movie with Dr. Jackson, and he was very pleased at how close it went along with it.
Joke, but not then.
Yeah, and but it's going back to the play this week, The Children of Eden musical theater. I had to listen to Dr. Jackson.
I didn't hear quite.
Yes, plenty of comments on that as we were watching it, and so it's music. Well, it's obviously was not exegetical, but just in comparison of those two things. Yeah.
I would love to watch Children of Eden with Dr. Jackson.
Yeah,
That sounds like fun.
Yeah, it's an experience. Welcome to my living room, but yeah.
All right, thank you. I'm going to turn this off now. I do have some,
I think most of it was the sound.
yeah, it was, got it. All right, so we're done with the sharing there, and I'll see if I can't get rid of actually the background just a bit. Got lots of backgrounds, unfortunately. But I'll try to full screen this here at least. All right, our next and third paper is from Andrea. What's your last name, Andrea?
Hyder.
Hyder.
Sorry.
And the name of the name of her paper is Societas and Salvation, Augustine and his Theological Discourse on Marriage.
Thank you. Hey, I'm Andrea Hyder, and I am a history and humanities double major here. And I wrote this paper for my Humanities 490 last fall. I'll begin with a quote from Augustine. Marriage seems to be useful not only because of the procreation of children, but also because of the natural sociability that exists between the different sexes. Otherwise, in the elderly, it would no longer be called marriage, especially if they had lost their children or had not had any. In this quotation, Augustine examines how marriage is a valuable form of Christian relationship. He emphasizes the natural sociability, Societas, within partnerships. Societas is a term that Augustine uses, and David G. Hunter fleshes it out. Societas is what Hunter calls the mutual union, harmony, and compassion and companionship of the couple. In other words, it's a monogamous relationship that benefits both the husband and the wife. The soteriological value, or like the redemptive and salvific value of this partnership, exists within Augustine's three goods of marriage. One, the objective of procreation. Two, the faithful observance of chastity. And three, the sanctity of the sacrament of marriage. Societas safeguards salvation through the marital bond, whether the couple produces children or not. Although Augustine sees value in producing children, he refuses to accept it as a requirement for salvific marriage. Therefore, it is the sacrament of marriage and the compassionate relationship it produces that safeguards one's salvation. In this paper, I will extend Hunter's claim that Augustine's view of marriage is a charitable union between husband and wife by arguing that Augustine sees soteriological value within the union of marriage, being substantiated by the following texts: On the Good of Marriage, On Virginity, and Sermon 354a. While I do not aim to provide a complete account of Augustine or Societas, I hope my contribution shows that Societas is something that fosters and enhances the couple's salvation. Scholars focus heavily on sexual renunciation and marriage in Augustine's thought, but briefly, if at all, reference Societas. Hunter briefly discusses Societas while summarizing marriage in On the Good of Marriage, and claims that Augustine's position in this treatise more positively addresses sex, marriage, and celibacy than the Soliloquies, which is an earlier work from Augustine. John Cavadini addresses Augustine's understanding of marriage as a social effort, where one maintains one's virginity through the sacrament of marriage. Apart from Hunter, who analyzes Societas, and Cavadini, who nearly discusses it through sociability within both marriage and the church, there is not much discussion surrounding the topic. The lack of research in this area leaves Augustine vulnerable to critics who believe that his theology is entirely negative towards sexuality. In fact, Augustine sees marriage as an altruistic partnership between husband and wife, and indeed, On the Good of Marriage, On Virginity, and Sermon 354a signify that Augustine finds soteriological merit within the marriage bond. Regardless of scholarly cohesion or divergence on dates, all agree that Augustine composes both treatises and the sermon because of polemical disputes and ecclesial issues concerning sex, renunciation, and marriage. In terms of Augustine's interlocutors, one does well to remember that both the Manichaeans and Jerome play a part in moving Augustine towards writing about sex, celibacy, and marriage. And the Manichaeans were a heretical group that were traditionally believed that the body was evil. And to negate that, they tried to separate themselves from the body as much as possible. So most of them were celibate. And I think a lot of us have heard of Jerome. He has a track record for being negative towards marriage and sex. Their approach to how Christians should view intercourse and renunciation is too pessimistic. And the fact that Augustine refutes them indicates that he commits to a more optimistic conclusion. Optimism and pessimism are too binary to accurately describe his understanding of celibacy, sex, and marriage. Instead, recognizing that pessimism and optimism exist in a continuum is an essential step towards correctly interpreting his thought. Through Augustine's refutation of both Jerome and the Manichaeans, his view of marriage becomes something more than a forbidden fruit, so to speak. He concludes in the treatises and sermon that marriage is a loving bond between husband and wife that should not be broken, and that through Societas, God protects the salvation of both partners. In Augustine's thought, marriage serves to guard the wife and husband from the sins connected to sexual desire and lustful intercourse. Through On the Good of Marriage, On Virginity, and Sermon 354a, he makes the claims that Societas in marriage is salvific in the following ways. 1, Societas absolves the sin of uninhibited desire. 2, childbearing serves as a fruit of Societas. And 3, spouses give up their own bodies for one another through Societas. Societas safeguards salvation, also enhances the holiness of the couple. Therefore, it is not only protective, but also constructive. Through expressing Societas in these ways, Augustine finds salvific worth in marriage. Augustine explains how Societas pardons the sin of uninhibited desire by stating, in their case, those who cannot practice celibacy, marriage is not a sin, although if it were chosen as an alternative to fornication, it would be less of a sin than fornication, but still a sin. In other words, when one compares sexual intercourse intermaritally and extramaritally, the former never ceases to be sinful, but it is less so than the latter. However, marriage itself is chaste and excuses one's punishment for uninhibited desire. Sex is absolved through marriage because of the sacramental union between wife and husband. So marriage is not the sin, fornication is, and marriage protects Christians who are unable to be continent from damnation by sexual impiety. In this way, Societas safeguards one within the marriage union by God's forgiveness of unrestrained lust. Because Societas within marriage intercedes on one's behalf, Augustine encourages it for Christians in the church who are ill-equipped to curb their lust alone. However, he discourages one who entertains pleasure-seeking thoughts while married. He writes, but it wasn't the good of marriage that the apostle found fault with, but the evil of lack of restraint, which consists of making use of one's wife beyond the necessity of begetting children. He argues that marriage absolves unrepressed lust and thus arbitrates with God on one's behalf. By appealing to one's fear of eternal suffering, he illustrates what happens to one overcome with lust while still married. Desire has been roused, you have been defeated, you've been dragged along, but you haven't been dragged away from your wife. The penalty for being overcome by unrestrained desire would overtake you, unless the fear of your being married and the fact of your being married interceded for you. For an unmarried person lacking self-control, extramarital sex and impious behavior flourishes with nothing to absorb one's offense. When licentiousness overwhelms the married Christian, however, marriage serves to forgive one of one's sins and prevent everlasting misery. In this way, marriage operates as a safeguard because the wife and husband benefit from maintaining their redemption through the marriage union. While Augustine does not require married couples to produce children, he finds that childbearing serves as a fruit of Societas in marriage. While he believes that one cultivates the virtue of obedience within marriage, he states that virginity remains the superior practice. Even so, marriage is still considered a good and not a sin, and he says to the virgin, the preservation of your virginity consoles you for what you miss in not having children, and we are compensated for our loss of our virginity by the benefit of having children. So here he compares the virgin's sexually immaculate state to the married woman's ability to bear children through marriage. In the same way that virginity has Christ as its paradigm, procreation within marriage has the church as its archetype. In this way, producing children through marriage helps to atone for one's lack of virginity, although couples need not have children to be saved, as long as they exemplify Societas within their relationship. Even though producing offspring is not a requirement of marriage, it is a fruit of Societas because God calls one to be fruitful and multiply, which serves to help redeem the married couple. Regardless of whether couples produce offspring, he determines that covenantal partnerships, which require care and understanding from both persons, exhibit Societas. He preaches on, to illustrate his claim to the church, Augustine concentrates on marriage in a pastoral context. He preaches on Matthew chapter 9, verse 3, which is the story of the Pharisees questioning Jesus and asking if a husband can divorce his wife for any reason. And remarks, so married couples have something to learn from the Lord's reply, and so do those who are not yet married or have already formed the good intention of foregoing marriage. However, in Sermon 354a, his concern revolves around how married Christians engage in or abstain from sexual intercourse, and he later reveals that he affirms marriage but denounces divorce for the reason that one desires abstinence and the other does not. A non-consensual relationship, whether it be sexually abstinent or not, will never exhibit Societas because a morally and spiritually edifying partnership requires mutual understanding and agreement concerning sexual intercourse. In addition to a non-consensual partnership, Augustine discusses why infidelity also does not express Societas in marriage. He discusses adultery within marriage and explains why Paul's dictum, do not defraud, which is withholding conjugal debts from one another, do not defraud one another except by an agreement for a time, does not pertain to infidelity. When two individuals unite through marriage, according to Augustine, they agree to compensate one another for the conjugal dues owed to them. The dues not only include sexual intercourse for procreation's sake, but also an arrangement supporting a sexually abstinent partnership. Either path the pair chooses, the decision must be consensual. Otherwise, one partner is owed a debt that the other fails to reimburse. A sacramental marriage does not rest its foundation upon shaky ground such as this, however. In order for the nuptial relationship to function and benefit both the couple and the church properly, communication and consensus is key. Both persons must be willing to compromise their preferences if it is proven to be necessary to create a partnership which prioritizes Societas. It would be beneficial to discuss Augustine's thought in conversation with contemporary sexual ethics. Scholars disagree about whether Augustine denounces sexual desire or if he simply questions its place in intercourse. Gilbert Mailander approaches this issue from the latter view. To him, Augustine does not seek to isolate sexual pleasure from the act itself, but instead embraces their corporation when done in a mutually beneficial way, such as gratification without lust. In other words, sexual pleasure is not harmful in and of itself, but develops into such if and when it becomes the sole reason for procreation. He seems to claim that lust can be holy in marriage, which is not what Augustine says. Even though Societas safeguards the couple's salvation, it does not condone sexual desire. While Mailander affirmatively describes Augustine's perspective on sex and desire, Lisa Sowell Cahill argues that there is little evidence that Augustine regards sexual desire as a positive. She writes that Augustine might categorize desire as lust, and if so, he probably regards no beneficial purpose or function for Edenic procreation, which is sex in the Garden of Eden. She addresses Augustine's view of desire and the will, in which the will is overcome by desire, and thus one becomes unable to control one's sexual urges. Moreover, she describes Augustine's account of Edenic sex as mechanical or performed simply for reproductive purposes and devoid of passion. Through her interpretation, she determines that sexual desire is less like eating and more like breathing or moving one's limbs, done for necessity and not for enjoyment. She concludes, therefore, that Mailander's argument is insufficient and oversimplifies Augustine's complex relationship with erotic desire. However, Sowell Cahill fails to recognize Societas and its role in marriage. She assigns sexual desire a machine-like characteristic, which allows intercourse to occur without passion. And on the contrary, Augustine claims that sexual desire is inevitable in fallen humans, but Societas works to protect one's salvation in marriage. In this way, when lust overcomes either the husband or the wife, Societas prevents the couple from sinning through hedonism. As a mediator of sorts between Mailander and Sowell Cahill, Stephen Schaeffer argues that scholars blame Augustine for dispersing a pessimistic view of sex that negatively influences Christian sexual ethics. Unlike Mailander and Sowell Cahill, Schaeffer includes Augustine's anthropology in the conversation. He summarizes Augustine's perspective by stating that desire is familiar to all people and neutral in nature. However, the state of one's will changes the meaning of desire. If an individual directs the will towards God, then desire becomes blameless. But if the opposite is true, desire ceases to be righteous. Schaeffer concludes then that Augustine attributes the righteousness or corruption of the desire to human will and not to the desire itself. Schaeffer's analysis of Augustine's thought is much closer to Societas in marriage than either Mailander's or Sowell Cahill's evaluation, because he recognizes that desire is not immoral itself, but how one engages with it that makes it sinful. Generally speaking, as Schaeffer notes, Augustine often bears the burden of criticism from scholars as the theologian who single-handedly ruined sex for the Western world. As observed through examining both Meilander's and Schaeffer's research, there are ways to interpret Augustine optimistically. One need not interpret Augustine's sexual ethics at face value, especially when critical analysis of his relevant treatises and sermons often results with more encouraging conclusions. While Sol Cahill does not appreciate his view of the goods of marriage, Meilander believes Augustinian optimism solely consists of sex and desire, which leaves no room for Societas to preserve one's redemption. Although it's definitely not wrong to discuss Augustinian optimism, one has to be wary as to what one considers optimistic. Genuine optimism in Augustine's thought can be found in his view of Societas. With Societas in marriage, God both vouchsafes and safeguards the couple's redemption. To Augustine, sex and desire are sinful without Societas in marriage, but Societas liberates one from the sin one would otherwise incur. So I hope to have presented a compelling case for Augustinian optimism. Through monogamous and altruistic marriage, or Societas, between wife and husband, married Christians receive redemptive benefits, such as liberation of sin from unrestrained lust. Scholars and novices alike should recognize that his thought is more than sex positive or negative, and can be situated in a liminal space between the numerous options available. By analyzing Augustine in this way, I do not expect to transform the current discussion among scholars. I do, however, hope to instigate closer readings of his work and initiate conversations about how to liberate Augustine from Augustinian pessimism. Thank you.
Questions, comments, engage.
I have a real question.
Okay.
So I think one of the things that is oddest to people today about Augustine's view is that you can lust after your spouse in such a way that it's sinful, right? I mean, lust is by definition sinful. And I think a lot of Christians today would say, well, the very fact of being married, sort of makes it impossible to lust in a sinful sense after your spouse. And so I guess my question for you is, what do you think, when you talk about lust within marriage, for a spouse for another, is that, and maybe you hinted at this, is that just sexual desire, full stop? Or is it something more than that? Is it a kind of desire to dominate? Is it a desire for one's own gratification, sort of regardless of the status of the spouse? Could you, the three texts you look at, could you piece together an answer from those texts?
I don't know. I would think that it would have to be, it would have to be more than just lust for sex, right? I mean, from my reading of it, I mean, I don't have like a very conclusive answer to it, but I would think that it would have to be more than just, as you said, full stop. I would think that he would have to have a more nuanced answer than that. I'm just not exactly sure what that is.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if maybe the idea is that perhaps sexual desire for a spouse per se is not sinful, but in real life circumstances, that desire gets real disorder real fast. Mm-hmm. And that's where the Societas kicks in to sort of redeem that disordered desire. Mm-hmm. That seems like, and I really don't know the answer, but an important question about whether we're just talking about sexual desire or desire disorder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good distinction to make too. Yeah.
It seems like what I heard with you talking about Societas is also, it has this emphasis on mutuality and the good for larger society, you know, and therefore the kind of this issue of mutuality seemed to be central for kind of the essence of it. Right. So that kind of working through. I have a question.
Yeah.
It seems to me, if I heard you right, that Societas kind of serves in some ways as an inoculation. I'm going to use my own language here. An inoculation against the evil of sex. But he also talks about marriage as being a sacrament. Now, from my essence of understanding of sacraments are actually a means of grace, positive issue. So I see these almost in conflict. The idea that you got this kind of negative, this inoculation kind of protecting you from the bad things, but he also wants to call marriage a sacrament, which is actually a positive benefit. Can you think your way through that? How do you think Augustine would address that.
Yeah, I would think that, I would assume that the sacrament of marriage and Societas, in my mind, at least, I kind of separate the two, because if you're, I mean, the sacrament of marriage, just because you're married doesn't necessarily mean you love each other. And I would think that the Societas, it has to be like a mutual, like it has to be a mutually beneficial and compassionate relationship. And I would think that since that is so, that there might be like a small difference between the two. I'm not sure if I'm getting at your question.
Yeah.
But
Well, it's just kind of tonality, I guess. So Pietas struck me all the way through here as being kind of serving as a mitigating force.
Mhm.
Whereas sacrament is never a mitigating force, it's actually a full stop positive.
Well, and that raises another question, which does he talk about marriage as a sacrament in these texts?
Yes, I think that marriage, I know that John Cavadini does. And I think that Augustine also does. I think that's actually his wording of it, is that marriage is a sacrament. And that's one of the 3 goods of marriage, is that marriage is a sacrament. Yeah.
Well, very good. Any other one? Matthew?
How would Augustine's relationship with Una, could that have affected his view?
That's a good question.
That's very interesting. So like,
Yeah,
how would that affect his view of sex in marriage as well?
that's an interesting, I hadn't thought about that actually. I don't know. Honestly, I mean, I would assume that he develops this idea throughout his, I don't know if I would say lifetime, but he develops this idea, and he wasn't always this accepting towards the idea of marriage. Though I'm not quite sure how much of it had to do with his partnerships. It might have. I mean, I don't have the answer to that. That's definitely a good point, because I didn't think about that. But I don't have a good answer for you there. But I would say, if just for me, I would think that it would have to have something to do with it.
Yeah.
I mean, how could that not have emphasis somewhere? But I don't know, honestly.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we're a little bit after hour, but that was fun. We got a little late start because of some technology issues. Let's give a final hand to all of our presenters. On the table are some things for next year's presentation. So feel free to grab some of those, please.
I would like you to do the survey. Online people, I'm sure you'll be getting some information too, so take a survey.
All right. I'm going to end it for those of you out there in Zoom land.